Hello, welcome everybody to this RISE webinar. My name is Mark Hinstridge. I'm the Chief Economist at Oxford Policy Management and co-director of the RISE programme. It's jointly run through OPM and the Blavatnik School of Government in Oxford, and is a major research programme into learning and education systems. And we're using webinars more and more because we're under a pandemic. More importantly, we're under a set of lockdowns, which only now are beginning to be eased in different countries. And the lockdowns have had a major impact on lives and on economies, and they've had a major impact on schooling. It looks pretty clear that these impacts don't just get reversed as lockdowns get eased, but have longer term impacts. And the longer term impacts on people's lives are very serious, and the longer term impacts on learning are also very serious. And this webinar is going to address the experience of long-term impacts on learning from two of RISE's excellent researchers and moderated by Luis Crouch. Luis is Chief Technical Officer of RTI's International Development Group, with deep experience across many dimensions of learning and education systems. And he's also part of our research directorate and on our intellectual leadership team. So thank you, Luis, and over to you.
All right, thanks very much, Mark. I'm very happy to be hosting, moderating, chair, whatever it is that I'm doing. We should have a very good session. There's a lot of work being done on the pandemic and its impact on education. I think this will be quite revealing because it's heavily empirical. But just on the World Bank's website, I noticed 38% publications. On the UNESCO website, they are actually uncountable, at least going by the website, because they're buried in there, but there must be hundreds. So there's a lot of discussion on this issue, and I think for good reason. I think since the creation of mass or universalized education, this may well be the first nearly universal closing as well. And so it's truly historically unprecedented times, and we're only now beginning to even get a glimpse of what the impacts will be. There are a lot of calls out there from all the people that you would expect, from UNESCO, from the bank, from various think tanks, to say, let's take advantage of the reopening to do things better as we go forward, difficult as that may be. And I think the panelists today are going to be giving us a sense of why that is so important, but also hopefully B, a sense of how one might go about it. What might it mean to do things a bit differently? We have two stellar panelists, Jishnu from Georgetown University and the Center for Policy Research, also from a long time associated and with the World Bank. Tahir Andrabi is a co-author in the paper. He's at Pomona College and LUMS, the Lahore University of Management Science, and Benjamin Daniels from Georgetown. And then Rukmini Banerji will be the other panelist. She's the CEO of Pratham in India, arguably the largest and most influential NGO in education in the world, I would say. And they'll be talking about, like I said, both the magnitude and the kinds of consequences that we can expect, but also how to hopefully rebuild in a more productive way. I'd like to draw the attention of the participants that there are other papers and insight notes and so on being published by RISE. Lant Pritchett, the research director, has a piece on the RISE website, recently very published, also from Jacobus Ciliers, who's from the RISE Tanzania research team, also has a piece very recently published. And yeah, just a reminder to the audience to check out the RISE website and look for these other pieces, as well as the insights that you might get from this workshop. So, like I said, Jishnu Das will be presenting with his team. I think Tahir may be able to join us. I'm not quite sure. And then Rukmini Banerji. So let me turn it over to Jishnu, and I hope he's logged on. Jishnu?
I am logged on. Louis, can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, wonderful. My video was having problems and it kept crashing the computer, so I gave up eventually on that. So thank you, first of all, for inviting me to present this work, and thank you also to all the participants for taking the time out. I know it's a difficult time, and I really appreciate all the assistance from the RISE team, the participants, and especially my co-authors, Benjamin Daniels and Tahir Andrabi. I'm not going to spend a lot of time. The paper has a lot of detail, as does the RISE note, but I did want to take you through what we felt was a fairly important set of results coming out of this work that we had done on the Pakistan earthquake. And you should be able to see my screen at this point. So as I mentioned, this is joint work with Tahir Andrabi, who's at Pomona College and currently the Dean of the School of Education at Lahore University of Management Sciences, and Benjamin Daniels, who's at Georgetown University. And just as a motivation, all of us who are here know that by now there's a large body of research that shows that insults in childhood, which the technical literature thinks about as adverse circumstances during childhood, and especially early childhood days with the focus on the 1000 days after birth, these insults can have lasting impacts on adult health, education, and earnings, even in cases or disasters where the immediate mortality impacts are among elderly people, and even as we are seeing in COVID, among elderly men. What we know less about is what are the impacts across a range of different outcomes. So for instance, what happens with adults, what happens with children, what happens with health, what happens with education, and for reasons that are fairly technical, usually we know what happens to the youngest children compared to the older children, but not what are the impacts across the full age range for all children. Finally, and this becomes pertinent to populations with the current pandemic, we don't have a good idea of what happens when disasters are followed by substantial compensation. And this is partly because most of the studies in low-income countries look at adult populations now, so people in their 50s, 60s, who were hit by a disaster 40 to 50 years ago. So it's obviously very hard to get information on what happened following that disaster. But even more, times have changed. We are no longer in a world that doesn't believe in social protection, that doesn't have the money, and understanding what happens if families receive compensation has now become a critical part of understanding how to manage these situations. So what we try and do in this paper, and I urge you to have a look at it, is we look at what happens 4 years after a disaster where households received substantial compensation. And the context is going to be the Pakistan 2005 earthquake, which was, for those of you who are logged in from Pakistan, you know very well, it was October 8, 2005 at about 8:30 a.m. It was a huge earthquake. It was 7.6 magnitude, and it was in a mountainous area of northern Pakistan. It left 73 to 78,000 people dead, more than 80% of houses and most physical infrastructure destroyed. The earthquake was unanticipated. So it was the first big earthquake to hit after 1935. There had been a smaller magnitude earthquake in the northwest frontier provinces, what's now Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, earlier in around the 70s, but that was in a very different region. And what we did was we worked pretty closely on the earthquake between November to March 2005. And then 4 years later, Tahir and I went back and we made a sample of 126 villages. I'll show you what these villages look like, where we went to every household. So this was about 28,297 households that we visited, and we collected some information on all these households. We collected more detailed information on 8,351 households. And finally, after we had completed this, we went back and did a very detailed survey of 2,456 households. Those of you who are familiar with household surveys know how this works. Just a couple of things that we'll be using. First, we measured the heights of all children who were older than 3 years at the time of the survey. There is a question of why we didn't measure people or children who were even younger. The reason was because in this area, and as you know, children who are below the age of 3 years, you actually have to measure by laying them out on a board, which is also the way funerals are carried out. And this was a very traumatic experience that we didn't want to intrude on. So we decided to leave that aside. And the last piece, we tested all these children at home in English, mathematics, and Urdu. And this was for all children who were 7 to 15 at the time of the survey. So they would have been 3 to 11 at the time of the earthquake. Again, why didn't we do younger children? Well, we've done a lot of testing in Pakistan, and with younger children, you cannot ask questions that are written. Even simple things like 5 plus 3, you actually need to sit down, explain with them. And that just required a different level of training among enumerators to get accurately, something we couldn't do in an area where it was sometimes taking us 2 to 3 days to reach a village. Okay, what's the main contribution? How do we want you to think about the main contribution of the paper? We feel the paper is important because it gives us causal impacts. I think we have been very careful to say these are, and worked quite hard to say these were the actual impacts of a disaster, a big earthquake that I will show you was followed by substantial compensation. And it wasn't until we started working on the paper that we realized that, look, you need a bunch of things to happen for us to claim that these are causal impacts. We need 5 difficult things all at once. The first is the disaster needs to be unanticipated, right? Which means that people are not able to take precautionary actions. The second is the affected populations need to be similar to unaffected populations. The third is it is a disaster, but if you have very high mortality in the affected areas, those who are alive may be very different from those who died. So you're going to see a selected sample later on. And finally, after the disaster, you need both low outmigration and low aid spillovers, right? Just to give you an example of why this is hard to get at, if you think about hurricanes, an advance warning means that those who take the brunt of a hurricane have chosen not to leave. And they're probably different from those who left. If you think about mortality and you look at the tsunami in 2004, the people who were most affected living close to the beach, mortality among them was 30%. And Elizabeth Frankenberg and Duncan Thomas have shown very clearly that the people who died were significantly different from those who survived. So a survey like ours, which comes 4 years later, would only be looking at people who survived who might be very different in affected and unaffected areas. Population movement has been a big problem, and aid spillovers are a big problem. If you have too much aid coming in, a lot of aid coming in, it also goes to areas that were not affected, boosting those areas up as well. So it's kind of hard to know what the impact of the disaster followed by aid really was. And finally, you need something unexpected. If it is something that can be predicted, it's very likely that the people who will choose to live closer to a disaster zone are very different from those who are living far away. And I'll give you one example. This is the San Andreas fault seen from the sky. And it's very clear, it is a line down the middle. This is not the case in the Pakistan, where all the fault lines are pretty deeply buried. You can't tell that there's any kind of fault line or predictability depending upon when you choose on where to live or where a village is based. So here's what we're going to do. So this is the area that's affected, and in this picture the crosses are the households that we surveyed. We have shown the main fault line, which is the Balakot Bagh fault line, as this hyphenated curve going through the center of the picture. We have also shown all the other fault lines in the area. But this is the critical part of this, which is, look, there are so many fault lines in the area that is really hard to argue that certain households who were living on this fault line, which happened to be the one that was struck in an unpredictable way, were very different somehow from those living on other fault lines. Right? And that's what we use in our statistical or econometric strategy, which is we try and look at what are the outcomes of people who were living far from the affected fault, but still on some fault line compared to those who were living right on the affected fault line. So having stressed that, let me now just show you the pictures, and I'm not going to show you tables, partly because they are in the paper, but I'll be very careful to tell you which pictures you should take as showing a statistically significant relationship. So this is one example of the exogeneity of this earthquake shock, which is we look at all these characteristics. So I'm just going to annotate for a second, if you don't mind. We're going to look at all, we're going to look at all these characteristics which are determined before the earthquake, right? So if you think about them, the houses with electricity, houses with potable water, these all come from a survey that was a census that was done in 1998, a while before the earthquake. If you look at these come from our household surveys, and they're all things that are determined before the earthquake happened. An adult height the earthquake is not going to affect the adult height, right? Finally, these variables, which are infrastructure variables, are things we collected. So we went to every village, we asked them, where was your water source before the earthquake? Then we went to that water source and geolocated it so we can see what the distance to the water source was. And the key point in all of this is there is no relationship between any of these characteristics and the distance to the fault line, right? All of them are small. They are statistically insignificant, with the one exception of electricity in the house, where the further away you were from the fault line, the less likely you are, the more likely you were to have electricity. And the only reason that happens is because of two villages, which you can actually leave out of the estimation and nothing changes. So if that makes sense, then let me move on to just showing you what the broad results are, and then pass it over for a discussion. So here are the main results that we find. Okay, so first of all, our marker of distance to the activated fault line is an exceedingly strong marker of what happened in terms of destruction in the area. So what we have drawn here, and let me emphasize what this is the distance to the activated fault. So for this, for example, this is a village that's 40 kilometers away from the fault line. And what you're seeing at the back, this histogram, is our sample. So these histogram points are just our sample. which shows that most of a sample is located between 0 and 30 kilometers, and then we have villages going all the way up to 50 kilometers. Key point I want you to notice is if you look at houses that were destroyed, the majority, if you were living on the fault line, that was pretty close to 100%. But it drops off very quickly, and by about 30 kilometers, the destruction levels out at about 10%. Right? You see that same pattern everywhere. You see it with village facilities, you see it with the mortality during the earthquake. And interestingly, if you look at people who died after the earthquake, which we would expect to be no different between villages that are close to or far from the fault line, in fact, there is no relationship. Okay, so this is a localized earthquake. It hits very hard for people who are living approximately 0 to 20 kilometers from the fault line. Okay, so here is what happens with aid. You find exactly the same pattern as we did with the destruction. So we have plotted different kinds of aid, but the main thing that I want you to see is, look, the aid was fairly well distributed. For people who were on the fault line and therefore the worst affected, the total amount of cash aid that came in over 2 years was more than 150% of the median annual consumption. So think about that as being 18 months of income that people received in cash. You see again that by about 30 kilometers, it peters out. These are the areas that were the most affected. You see a sharp decline till 30 kilometers, and from 30 kilometers out, aid drops off basically to 0. Right? So this is what we mean by a compensated earthquake, a compensated disasters. There's a big disaster, and then people receive money after that disaster to tide them over. Okay. What happened as a result of this earthquake? I'm not going to give you lots of slides on this. Let me show you 2-3 different pictures and a couple of graphs, and then hand it over. This is roughly 3 months after the earthquake and the schools that were set up. Interestingly, even though private schools didn't receive any compensation because they were businesses and not households, they were the first to set up about 3 months after. And you can see how they tried to do it. They used relief tents, they put all the children together, and they were trying to teach or at least get the kids in school during that time. And this is the houses or the situation that people were living in approximately 4 months to 5 months after the earthquake. You can see they had pitched their tents on their houses itself to show inspectors that they actually had a dwelling and the dwelling had been destroyed, which would make them eligible for compensation. Okay, what happens 4 years later? I'm going to go through this fairly quickly. The first plot here tries to tell us what happens for children at different ages during the earthquake. So remember, somebody who was in utero, that means they hadn't been born, but they were in their mother's womb at the time of the earthquake, would be about 3 years old now. Somebody who was 11 years old at the time of the earthquake would be about 15 now, right? What we have plotted in this top graph here is what happens across the age range for children who were living close to the fault line, so that's this, and children who were living far. And we have chosen 20 kilometers because that's about the point from where you don't see any further effect. Main thing to pick up from here is in terms of weight for age, there's really no difference. These lines are overlapping. And then when we try and look at it with distance in particular and look at the most sensitive age groups, which are the in utero and the newborn to age 2, as well as the age 3+, there's really no relationship with distance. If we thought that people who were close by were badly affected, we should have seen something that sloped up, maybe like that, maybe like that. But what we don't. What we see is essentially a rising and falling pattern, but there's no strong relationship between distance to the fault line and what happened during this earthquake. Okay. In contrast, and this is really sharp contrast to this, what we see with height for age is completely different. So here again we have plotted exactly the same pictures. So this is again with age, and this is the people who were close to the fault line and people who were far. You see two patterns. Above the age of 3, again, the lines are very, very similar. They're overlapping. But look what happens below the age of 3. A gap opens up, right? And for children who were in utero at the time of that earthquake, that gap is very big. It's about 1 standard deviation, which is a massive gap in this literature. And you can see again in the graph below that the distance really matters in exactly the way that the destruction happened, right? So these are children who were age 3+, again, no effect on them. But among the children who were newborn to age 2 or in utero, a big gap opens up between children who were close to the fault line here and children who are far away who are doing much better. In the next graph, we're now turning to education, which is going to be the focus over here. The first thing, and this is important to point out, is there are no enrollment effects. So I've tried to show exactly the same graph again with age and distance to the fault line. And we see no enrollment effects at all in this population. Two things are particularly interesting. We see no enrollment effects for boys and no enrollment effect for girls. Yeah.
This is Luis Crouch. You're at 20 minutes.
Okay.
Wait, though. I've had private comments directly to me, not even through the Zoom, about how fascinating this is. But at the same time, I wanted to tell you that we are at 20 minutes. So what I would recommend is that, given that these data are so fascinating, that you really hit hard on the most important points, but then speed it up with regard to the more general points, because you are at time.
Okay, I've got 2 slides left, so let me just finish.
Brilliant.
Yeah. Okay, so the point that we want to make, which is key for our discussion, is even though there are no enrollment effects or grade attainment effects, we do find these very large effects on test scores. So now 2 issues are critical here. The first is that we are seeing these gaps open up for children at all ages, not only among the youngest or the oldest. And second, these gaps are very large. So look, the way to think about what these gaps look like is if you were close to the fault line and you're 6 years or somewhere here, you're performing the same as a child who's 2 years younger than you. So these kids have lost almost 2 years of schooling in terms of their test scores during this time. And this is one of the key findings in our paper on this material. I want to emphasize 2 more things and then stop, which is how big are these effects? So if we use existing numbers from the literature, this is our take-home kind of big message here. We're estimating that at peak losses, the earnings losses for this cohort will be 15 to 18% in every year of their life moving forward, which corresponds to about 5% of earnings in the area. So this is not, just, oh, they're losing a little bit of test scores. It's they're losing 2 years of schooling. And those 2 years of schooling are absolutely massive in terms of the effects we might see down the road in this context. And finally, and this is where I stop, one key issue is people have been thinking that, look, once the schools come back up, things will be back to normal. But what this picture shows you is they're not, right? What we find when we do what's called a mediation analysis is that school closures accounted for only 10% of the losses. So think about it this way: the schools closed for about 4 months. So if we had expected the school closure to explain all the losses, we should have seen 4 months of losses. Instead, 4 years later, we are seeing something close to 24 months of losses, right? So that means that not only did they lose while the schools were out of session, but they continued to lose when they came back. And this was my final slide. This was not for everybody. So the mothers who had the children whose mothers had primary education were actually fully protected against these test score losses. These test score losses hit only the children whose mothers had no education at all. You see this in this big gap that develops exactly in the area where the earthquake hit the hardest. Okay, so I am going to conclude pretty much now with the following, which is we have looked at a large shock followed by in-kind and cash aids. We see recovery for all adult outcomes, for all infrastructure consumption, but not for children's test scores or height. And in fact, such a disaster also creates inequality within the area that were hit. Academic advantages of children with educated mothers are magnified 2 to 3 times in the earthquake areas relative to others. And I think there are going to be big implications for the current crisis. At this point, I'll pass it over to Luis, who might want to just bring in Tahir or move on as you see fit. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jishnu. Those are. I mean, I don't often use the expression mind-blowing, but this is mind-blowing stuff. I think this is really work that the world should be thankful to you for, and your team and your collaborators. Tahir, do you have like a 30-second intervention that you could make, or should I just move on to Rukmini?
I will just add a minute or so. Obviously, as you can see, right? I mean, one of the harder things in this current pandemic is really how to establish the counterfactual. We had a neat counterfactual with people away from the fault line. In this pandemic, really trying to figure out what is the baseline around which we are trying to judge. I think that's one of the hard questions. There are some places where we can do that. Second is there is very little evidence being collected right now as to what is going on, both within households and schools, as the schools are closed and pretty much all surveys have been stopped. We are operating in a very a bad informational environment right now in terms of what's going on with learning losses concurrently as things are happening. I'd like to just add one more thing, which is, I mean, we have been doing some work a lot with our partner private schools and both low cost and high cost in terms of seeing how they are responding to the current closure and their experiences with technology. And, I mean, at one level, this was supposed to be the EdTech moment, right? Where all schools are closed and these guys, after years of venture funding, have come in. The experience looks actually pretty bad so far in terms of how schools are being able to use it. And particularly if you go down the income strata, if you go down to even like mid-level private schools, which are not poor, which are serving middle class, the mitigation happening because of technology just seems really difficult. The schools are scrambling to get working with kids. So I think that this current period looks not that great given whatever evidence we have. I can come later if needed.
All right, thanks. And let's turn it over to Rukmini now from the CEO of Pratham. And just a caution to the people sending in questions and answers. At first, I was a little worried because there weren't many coming in. Now there are plenty coming in. Just to let you know that if the amount of questions is overwhelming, what I might do is try to pick a few sort of common sets of issues that people seem to be concerned about and kind of group them for the presenters to address. So let's turn over to Rukmini from Pratham, please.
Thank you, Luis. This is a great opportunity, partly because for someone like me, I can get to hear researchers and have it explained in the wonderful way that Jishnu did. I'm going to come at it from the point of view of, what we have learned from the ground and what our concerns are as we go ahead. My first point is that I wonder if we should think about this current situation in terms of a disaster, because like Jishnu pointed out, earthquakes, tsunamis affect a certain part of the world. Like in the case of the earthquake in Gujarat some years ago, the money that came in, the compensation, the aid that came in, they say that in Bhuj, you could have built 3 schools for every 1 school that was destroyed. Now, that's certainly not the case right now. I think there is going to be, and we are already seeing it and feeling it here in India, that there is economic hardship across the board, whether it is individuals, whether it's families, whether it is schools, whether it is governments. I think everywhere there is going to be a significant drop in resources that are available. And that will bring with it, obvious implications for not just for learning, but I think for schooling as well. We've made, at least in India, huge strides over the last 10, 20 years on enrollment. And to some extent, we've started taking universal enrollment almost as granted. And I wonder if we, as we return to whatever will be the routine after this period, I think we may have to really look carefully at enrollment again. While India has reached almost 96% overall elementary school enrollment for the last more than 10 years, there are some other patterns of enrollment that are worth looking at. We have, broadly speaking, about 25 million children in each age group. And if you look at enrollment about 10 years ago or more in 8th grade, you had about 11, 12 million kids who were reaching 8th grade. But this number in more recent years is close to 22 million. So we have many more kids not only enrolled, but staying all the way up to 8th grade. And I wonder if, as we look ahead, whether these numbers will remain this high, as we see they did in Pakistan around the earthquake areas, or whether something will have to be done to maintain and ensure that everybody who was enrolled in school in March of 2020 returns to school whenever schools open. The second relationship that I feel that we need to look carefully at is, at least in India, we have very varying attendance patterns on any given day in school. And, in our own work in villages and in schools, we see a close relationship between attendance and achievement. And I've always wondered, which is the chicken and which is the egg, because we see lower attendance, especially in states like Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, Rajasthan, where we monitor almost weekly attendance patterns of the programs, at least in which Pratham has a direct input. We see that the low achieving children also have low attendance. And as their achievement levels go up, their attendance goes up. In the coming months, there are going to be, even after schools reopen, I think both at a local level as well as at an individual level, I think we are going to see much more ups and downs of attendance. And since attendance is closely linked to learning, I think we will have to monitor that as well, particularly of groups who we know are going to be more severely affected. Jishnu's point that educated mothers are a good protection against shocks, at least to the learning environment. I think a large number of students in India, especially going to government schools, have mothers who don't have much schooling themselves. And therefore, I think there are vulnerable groups in all areas that we will have to keep an eye on. Particularly, I think the girls who have reached 7th or 8th grade, who are in 7th or 8th grade now, whose learning levels may not be very high, may be the first who are withdrawn from school as families have to have more adults going on to look for work. And then, of course, the learning loss, which I think everybody is talking about, and which, based on Jishnu's work and any other work, seems to be a big concern. So, where are we, and what should we do? I am going to use some slides, which I'll bring up in a little while. I felt since I'm in a research conference, I must have some numbers that I show. But I think it's wrong to call it an advantage, but a big element of our current context is that the learning loss that is inevitable is being talked about and worried about, across the board. And I think that is a big plus in how we will plan ahead. Because although it is well known that learning levels are not high and that there is a crisis, I think that this big shock to our entire system, worldwide, national, local, global, has shaken people up to look at problems in a new way. And therefore, the fact that when schools reopen, we are going to have to pay specific attention to learning, I think presents an opportunity. The other thing that I see, at least in India, and I can't speak for anywhere else, is that we see a lot of openness, both within the communities as well as with the government, in trying to look for new solutions. While technology has been used in many different ways, and I think everybody's learning how to use it, we see a great deal of openness for collaboration within government, across civil society and government. And I think that, again, brings to the fore that there will be hopefully scope for a lot of collaboration and new ideas as we go along. And a third point that at least we are seeing in over 10,000 villages where we have a direct contact and have had over the last 3 months, although it has been from remote, is that we see that parents are coming up. What we do in our 10,000 villages is that we are sending messages, some WhatsApp messages which go to parents with smartphones, but a large number of parents are getting SMS messages from us, and somebody from our side phones and connects with parents. And we see that even on little SMS kinds of activities, parents, even uneducated parents, are actually making a big effort. So as schools reopen and as we go further, I think using parents, using community people as resources to help in the reopening of schools and in rebuilding of learning will be really important. So I'm going to take just a few minutes to show you a couple of ideas that I think we feel from Pratham would be extremely useful to think about as we go ahead. In the work that we have done so far, let me just pull up the right slides here. We think that as soon as possible, a very, very simple assessment. This is the ASAR tool in Hindi. In India, we have them in many languages. A very simple assessment, one-on-one on basic reading and arithmetic would be a very good thing to do. Whether it's a teacher or an instructor of any other kind, doing this face-to-face, one-on-one, quick interaction with children gives you a sense of where the child is at. So meet the child at the level at which the child is, and also gives you a sense of how a whole group, whatever the group is that you will be dealing with, how does the individual fit and how does the group fit. Using our ASAR results from the past, this is ASAR 2018, we know that even pre-COVID, in a normal circumstance, there's a big diversity of learning in any given grade. If I just look at 5th grade, which you can see here, there's about half the kids who are reading at a 2nd grade level or higher, but then there is a full half, which I can't call it the tail of the distribution because half the body cannot be the tail, is distributed along these many different levels. And so we already had this kind of a diversity. As you come into the future, when schools open, I think at least in India, we are going to see a bigger mix because we are already beginning to see in some states of northern India, private school children who are attending private schools in rural areas coming into the government schools. And so perhaps the distribution of learning levels within any given grade is going to increase. So the solution that we see, I want to show you one more, that even within India, this is a second grade, this is a third grade math performance in ASER 2018 based on a second grade level. And you can see that we range all the way from levels which are grade 3, which has less than 10% kids at grade 2 level, all the way up to a much higher number. So we are going to see different effects across the country and different effects even within grades. And as a system, we have to be ready about how we are going to deal with it. Typically, what we have done in India, both directly as Pratham ourselves, as well as working with a lot of state governments, is sort of use this basic simple assessment to group children by their level, by their current level, and not by grade. In big, large schools, this is done sometimes even within the grade by level. But in many cases, we group kids, let's say 3rd, 4th, and 5th grade together by level and not by grade, and use a different set of activities and materials for each group, track progress periodically, and use this teaching at the right level mode to move kids further. And to give you a sense of when it is done in a very large system, which had low baseline levels, the kinds of results that we can see, this is some data from 2018-19 from Uttar Pradesh, UP, which is a very large state, our largest state in India. And you can see that implemented by school teachers, but in a very focused manner, you could see quite large, almost 25 percentage point improvement in reading levels. If you just look at the two greens, you can see that at baseline, even in grades 3 and 4 put together, only about 1/4 of the kids could read even at 1st grade level. And that number has gone to, well above 50%, close to 60% in a period of about 45 to 60 days.
Rukmini, this is Luis. You have about 3 minutes.
Yes, so I'm just going to wind up. So I think that I looked back at the data that we have. The data that we have is largely from either ASER, which is done totally independently, or when we work in partnership with state governments. And the UP program that you just saw, there was a measurement done after the summer vacation, 3 or 4 months after the last end line. And there we saw for grades 4 and 5, a learning loss of about 10 to 12%. And so what that made me think is, if we look at what is a usual gain over the year, compare that to when there's a big push from the system, we see a difference. In our ASER data year on year, you see at maximum a 10 to 12% improvement year on year, depending on the grade, in, let's say, the percentage of kids who can read at a 2nd grade level. Compare that to when the government can do a very focused push, where all systems are focused on trying to get these foundational learning levels on, like in the case of UP. It is possible within a period of 3 or 4 months to see a 20 or 25 percentage point improvement. So my hope is that when schools reopen, we can put aside grade level curriculum, really focus on the foundational skills, work on them consistently for a long period, not just for 3 months, but perhaps for a period of the remainder of the school year, if necessary, going into the next summer, to really use this 2020 year across the board for building this foundation. The Indian government has declared a national mission for foundational literacy and numeracy, which we think is a very, very welcome move, because this gives the opportunity that regardless of what happens thanks to the schools being closed, and now we can see from what Jishnu said, that after schools open, making sure that we don't go back to business as usual, remaining focused on building foundational skills, will stand us in good stead as we move further. And my final point is that while a lot of conversation is happening about what we should do when schools reopen, we in Pratham are seeing these periods leading up to, we are not sure if schools will open in August or September, and actually what happens in the next couple of months will decide that. But we think that, reaching out to parents, reaching out to communities, sending very simple messages of simple activities that can be done, can almost act as a sort of a large campaign for getting ready to go back to school by starting work on foundational skills even earlier. And so I'm looking forward, and I hope that all the researchers who are listening to this, policymakers, will agree with me. I hope we have a discussion, but I hope we all agree that when we come back, we don't do business as usual. We meet the children at the level at which they come back to us and start from there and build, especially build on basic reading and basic arithmetic, so that the 2021 year can be a very different from any other. Thank you, Luis.
Thank you, Rukmini, for ending on that note. I think there have been 35 questions. If we try to address them individually, I think we may well be here for another few hours, especially given how interesting some of them are. So I attempted to group them for the sake of the sanity of the presenters. One, and some of them have already been sort of addressed, especially by Rukmini, but I'll note them anyway because I think they're so important. One is around which grades to prioritize, given both the results from Jishnu, but also Rukmini. I think that's sort of been answered, but it wouldn't be bad to hit it again. Another line of questioning had to do around the fact that in some of the systems, the COVID situation affects basically all schools because all schools have been closed, whereas the earthquake was a differential impact. So if all schools are closed and all schools try to reclaim some of the lost time, could that mitigate the impact a little bit? I think that also relates to the previous question around what was lost. A very important few questions were around how does this happen? Why is it that 4 months lead to 2 years of loss? And I think that also relates to the foundational years issue and the grades to be prioritized. Then there was a line of questioning around the long-term enrollment impact. Some of the fear from COVID is that some kids may drop out and never come back, particularly girls. And we have a sense, people were sensing that maybe, at least from the earthquake, that wasn't quite the issue. Lastly, well, a couple more. One is on mother's education. How exactly do we have a sense of how that works? What is the kind of causal pathway there, if you will? Two more. One is on, how large of an impact should we eventually be prepared to be? There, I will editorialize and say, what is your regret? What is likely to cause a bigger regret? To think that the impact will not be huge and under-prepare, or to think that the impact will be huge and maybe even over-prepare and over-correct, and think, what would you regret most? But I'll let the panelists address that. So lastly, one interesting point was the research implications. How do we, based on what we know from ASER, Pratham's ASER assessment, based on the research and household survey that was done in Pakistan, what are some tips for research methodologies such as respondent selection, sample design, and so on around COVID, and then taking into account the fact that maybe this is not the time where you want a lot of mobile teams going from house to house. So those I tried my best to group them, and I would welcome. Why don't we have just Jishnu come in for 5 or 7 minutes, and then Rukmini, and then we'll see if any other outstandingly huge questions come in that I can group, and maybe we can address those at the very end. Okay, so Jishnu, can you take over, please?
Sure. Luis, can you repeat them? No, I'm joking.
If I was smarter, I would have typed them up and shared them.
Yeah, no, I've got that. So I'm not going to take all of them, obviously. I'll take, I think, 3 important issues that I want to talk to, and then pass it over to Rukmini and the other panelists. One is, look, I think this study for us was important because it was a fairly unique and unfortunate opportunity to study what happens in a schooling system when schools are closed for a long time, right? Uh, and the fact that some schools were closed and some were not is precisely what allows us to do that. Otherwise, we can't compare. You're right. We wouldn't expect the results to be, very different in other contexts where most schools are closed, but it'll be much harder to understand what's happening because we don't have what we call a counterfactual, right? We don't have a normally functioning school system at this point anywhere. So I do want to stress that. Now, why did this happen and what can we do to mitigate this? I want to make a couple of points here that I think are important. I think so one way people have been calibrating what might be the impacts is to look at summer learning losses and saying, look, we have all these studies on when children are out of school during the summer, this is how much they lose. And the poor, children from poorer backgrounds tend to lose a little more than children from richer backgrounds. In fact, children from richer backgrounds in the US don't lose at all. I want to emphasize something very important, which is this is an unanticipated shock. When we think about summer learning losses, it's an anticipated change. My kids are both in school. It's very clear that the first month you come back after summer is to catch you up on all the stuff that you forgot over the summer and to bring you back up to speed. This is an unanticipated shock. And the problem is, part of the issue is going to be that school systems are going to have no option but to promote their children to the next grade, regardless of where they are. Right? That option is not even on the table. We can't say every child should redo the grade that they're in now and hold them back for a year. It's chaotic. It's going to create chaos. So it's an unanticipated shock, and it's a universal shock. This is the other point that I do want to make, that look, the things we have on when children drop out and staying out of school for a while drops them out, usually those results are coming from situations where a household has received an income shock. The girl or the boy couldn't go to school for 3 months. All his or her classmates moved ahead. And now you can see the girl or the boy says, well, look, all my classmates are ahead. I don't want to go back to school and be held back. Right? Here, and I think this is what happened in the earthquake, it was a joint holding back of the entire cohort, and that might make different things different for children as we move forward. I want to, so two those kinds of points about, look, it's, this time is different, but maybe not, right? And two things to end up on. One is, people are thinking, and a lot of resources are being spent on trying to mitigate the shock while it's happening. And I hear a lot about online stuff and this. Look, I'll be frank. My kids have perfect broadband, except when my laptop crashes, which it apparently does a minute before important meetings. They have highly educated parents, one father who cooks, the lunch is on the table on time, everything that's in shape. They are learning precisely nothing through their online classes, right? And our, Zainab Qureshi, who works with us, did this fantastic work where in Pakistan, she put together a package of online material for all the private schools that we work with to use. And she approached 100 schools. This was online material developed, over 3 to 4 years by stellar groups. The demand for this was zero, because all the private school owners, and I'm paraphrasing Zainab here, but basically what I understand from what she was telling me was, they said, look, these materials have not been catered to a rural area where connectivity is poor, nobody has a phone, or some people have some kinds of phones. This is not going to work. It needs, what Tahir says, a large soft infrastructure to support the online stuff, which has not been built up at all. So I think it's going to be illusory to think that we can use online resources during this time and the kids will be fine, right? And I was interested to hear that Rukmini's conversation was all about what do we do after schools restart, rather than, what do we do at this time through online materials. I mean, I was actually trying to track, Rukmini, whether you used the word online even once, and you didn't, right? And maybe there's a reason for that. So how do we open up? We don't know, right? I mean, this is the other large confusion, which is every government is coming up with contradictory statements that changes day by day on how you open up and what you open up. There's a good reason to think that, you might want to open up the foundational years, early grades first. But then if you think about the South Asian system and you think about the fact that if you pass your board exams, you'll get a lot more money. Maybe you want to help those kids pass.
Jishnu, you need to wrap up so we can finish at 10:15.
So that was my last point.
All right.
All of these are going to be complicated issues, and Rukmini, it'll be good to hear from you on what you think about them.
Thank you, Rukmini. Over to you, and I'd like Pritchett to come in, for a couple of minutes at the very end. So Rukmini, if you can keep your remarks to about 4 minutes, that'd be great.
Luis, you're doing a great job as the voice of God, so you can just come in and cut us off when you feel we've gone over. Lots of really interesting questions. Obviously, not enough time to answer them. I'm going to just take three points. One is, Jishnu, I did mention at the end of my remarks about the period between now and when schools open. And I think that this period also should be dealt with as effectively as possible. I deliberately did not use the word online, which seems to indicate that there's some interaction which is going on from remote continuously. What we've been doing and what we've been very excited about is that you can send, for example, these, using old technology that we still have around, basic phones, 167 character SMSs, daily going to parents, 1 or 2 activities that often we are finding that the whole family seems to get involved in. Keep doing that, because that seems to be encouraging parents, particularly parents who are not particularly educated, to feel like they can get engaged in their children's learning. I mean, this we did not have on any large scale before. If this can be encouraged, that's wonderful. We are also seeing in certain states, in Maharashtra, in Uttar Pradesh, and perhaps in other states as well, radio is being used. And so how do you connect these daily inputs that are going to parents with a radio cover, which actually guides people? Again, we are not talking of lots of big chapters and many lessons, but small bits of activity that builds family engagement, that builds communities. With lockdown kind of loosening up, we see that there is scope for doing small structured activity in groups. And I'm talking about all of this leading up to when schools open. And potentially when schools open, you're going to need this whole continuum to support what goes on in school. The grade reopening question is a favorite question of mine. And, I'm sure you know exactly what I'm going to say. I think that once kids are fluent readers, can read with comprehension, there's stuff that they can do on their own, there's stuff that they can do with their friends. But when you haven't reached that level, that basic level of foundation, then it's very difficult for you to do anything on your own. And therefore, my strong preference would be continue whatever methods of remote or time-to-time, connections with the older kids. But with the younger kids, the more interaction we can have. Many states in India, teachers are going to be back in school by, the middle of July or whenever, well before schools reopen. And I feel like with all the social distance and whatever other safety norms in place, if teachers could be in touch with small groups of children, give them little bit of tasks, I think the preparation for school reopening would be good. So my preference would be reopen schools for the younger children. Don't have them come for all, 6 hours or whatever it may be. Have them come for short periods of time, have a shift system, engage parents, give them little tasks to do at home. It's time, that we started doing some of this. Luis, I need just 1 more minute. There are many things that I love about Lant, but one of them is that he writes papers with titles which are so good that you don't have to read the paper. And so my favorite paper is The Negative Consequences of Overambitious Curriculum. We had an overambitious curriculum. There is talk about lightening the curriculum. If you lighten it, it'll become an ambitious curriculum. it'll still have negative consequences. And so to all those who control curriculum, who may be listening in, I would say, can we put aside, not lighten curriculum, put aside things and really focus on building these foundational skills, both before school opens as well as after school.
Hear, hear. Thank you, Rukmini. And then we'll turn it over to Lent for a couple of minutes. I think we are supposed to end at 11:15. I don't know whether we will actually be cut off, but Lent, can you come in, please?
Yeah, I just like to say that I hope in this webinar and in other things, we're communicating the urgency of the message we have, and that we're trying to speak about a super urgent message with both precision and passion. It's not often that you actually have an urgent message. And I was thinking of this recent movie, 1917, in which one general can see something from his aerial survey that another general doesn't know. And if the other general doesn't get the information from the aerial survey, he's going to make a disastrous mistake. The education systems in the world are headed into making a disastrous mistake. They're headed into resuming schools with business as usual in ways that will cause the short-term losses of the COVID closures to cause long-term permanent damages to an entire cohort of children. And I feel RISE has put together a set of messages where we can see that this is coming, and we're trying to communicate the urgency of, and it's urgent because these schools are going to reopen in one way or another relatively soon. And if the message of get to and teach from the level of the child where it is in after this negative shock to their learning experience, if that message gets through, it's relatively straightforward to mitigate the consequences of the short-term shutdowns. If that message doesn't get through, the natural thing the schools are going to do is to reopen exactly as if fourth grade's fourth grade. I'm going to use the fourth grade curriculum. I'm going to use the fourth grade teaching exactly how we would without this shock. And it will, by all our evidence, pieced together from a whole bunch of different countries and experiences, lead to negative, permanent, long-term consequences for a major section of the population. And I hope that we can communicate this message both with the precision that Jishnu brings to all the things that are needed to be precisely correct, the passion and precision that Rukmini brings, and really change your minds that something needs to be done, not in years, but in weeks and months to make this different. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Lent. And we need to do precisely those things so that hopefully 4 months don't become 2 years of loss, or in fact more, as the kids simply get left behind. So I think we're supposed to end right now. So just quickly, thanks to the presenters. These are sobering reminders of what we need to do. And let's take to heart very much that ending point by Lent. Let's not reopen business as usual, because that is going to leave a whole generation or a whole cohort of kids way behind. So with that, I will close the webinar and say thank you very much to the presenters and to everyone who participated. Thanks a lot, everyone. Bye-bye.